On this Monday night, a dire warning about a deepening crisis. More than 1 million people in Gaza face famine.
This is an entirely man-made disaster.
As Canada's MPs vote on whether to recognize Palestine as a state. New predictions about the potential spread of measles in Canada.
It is an extremely transmissible infection.
The other vaccine-preventable illnesses also making a comeback. Trump's money troubles, how the billionaire cannot post his multi-million-dollar bond. Plus, the hype and hope hydrogen is a fuel of the future, why critics aren't sold on Canada's strategy.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Neetu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. MPs are back at work and they're debating a major change to Canada's foreign policy. The NDP has put forward a motion calling on Canada to officially recognize Palestine as a state. It's part of a series of initiatives the party believes could expedite peace in Gaza and across the Middle East. Our David Akin has been watching tonight's developments in the House of Commons. And David, there's been a last-minute negotiation between the New Democrats and the Liberals.
There has been, Neetu, and it's still very much up in the air. And really, it all revolves around this. For 50 years, across governments of all stripes, it has been a cornerstone of Canada's Middle East policy that Canada supports a two-state solution and that the state of Palestine can only come into existence through negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. The NDP today tried to change that policy.
By doing so, and in lockstep with our allies, we believe that such a move can help accelerate a much-needed diplomatic process to revive two-state negotiations.
It was an idea the federal Conservatives rejected.
Why is the member rewarding Hamas terrorists for their October 7th massacre in this House of Commons? She should be ashamed of herself.
But despite the Conservatives' objections, MPs from all other parties were ready to vote in favor of the NDP proposal of unilateral recognition of Palestine.
Le Bloc québécois va appuyer la motion.
That included many Liberal backbench MPs.
Either we stand for human rights everywhere and for everyone, or we don't. I will be voting in favor of this motion. I urge my colleagues to do the same.
But the vote would have split the Liberal caucus, many of whom opposed unilateral recognition.
There's a difference between shouting from the sidelines and governing a country, and this motion is stoking anger and pain among Canadians.
And so, after a day of often emotional debate, a last-minute compromise was reached.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the motion be amended as follows.
And that motion, that amendment coming just minutes before the vote in the House of Commons, would have essentially taken away what the NDP had proposed, watered down their motion, and essentially asked the House to reaffirm that cornerstone of Canadian foreign policy, which is Canada believes in a two-state solution that needs to be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians. All that debate all day long really did take the government back to where it started. Neetu.
All right. Thanks very much for that. That is David Akin in Ottawa. There's an urgent warning tonight about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with a new report showing that famine is imminent. The UN Secretary General says a UN-backed report on hunger in Gaza is an appalling indictment of conditions on the ground for civilians. 1.1 million people, about half of Gaza's population, are facing catastrophic hunger. In the northern Gaza Strip, famine is expected between now and May, and an estimated 300,000 people have no access to adequate humanitarian aid. Israeli troops raided Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital overnight. The Israeli military says 20 gunmen were killed in what it called an operation to thwart terrorist activity. The Hamas-run health ministry says the attack sparked a fire and led to multiple casualties. Hamas and hospital officials have denied claims by Israel that Al-Shifa is being used as a base for its operations. Al-Shifa is housing hundreds of displaced civilians. It's also one of the only operational healthcare facilities in the north, where hundreds of thousands of people are facing severe levels of malnutrition and starvation. Redmond Shannon reports.
A UN food warehouse in Gaza City. one of the few places in northern Gaza with supplies. People are hungry, people will die. Look at what is happening for 5 kilos of flour, says this woman. She is among the 300,000 people in northern Gaza. A United Nations-backed report says famine is set to happen there over the next 2 months. The UN and many non-governmental organisations define famine as at least 20% of the population suffering from extreme food shortages, along with 1 in 3 children being acutely malnourished, and when 2 out of every 10,000 people are dying daily from starvation or malnutrition. The report says half of Gazans, 1.1 million people, are facing catastrophic hunger.
This is the highest number of people facing catastrophic hunger ever recorded by the Integrated Food Security Classification System, anywhere, anytime. This is an entirely man-made disaster, and the report makes clear that it can be halted.
The European Union's top diplomat says Israel is, quote, provoking famine by blocking aid.
Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Yes. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Let's say that.
The document says all fighting must stop immediately to allow the required 300 trucks of food to enter Gaza every day.
What they're actually saying is don't win the war, which means lose the war. That's what it means.
On Monday, Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with US President Joe Biden on topics that include peace talks and Israel's plans to invade the crowded city of Rafah.
The president has rejected, and did again today, the straw man that raising questions about Rafah is the same as raising questions about defeating Hamas. That's just nonsense.
The White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also says the US now believes that Israel killed Marwan Issa, one of Hamas's top commanders, earlier this month. Meanwhile, in Qatar, peace negotiations continue this week. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
In Haiti, at least 12 people have been killed when gangs attacked upscale neighborhoods on the outskirts of the country's capital. A warning, the images in this story are disturbing. Gunmen attacked and looted homes overnight in 2 communities in Port-au-Prince that had largely avoided the escalating gang violence. It's the latest in a string of attacks that have worsened across the country despite the resignation of the Prime Minister. Residents are facing a shortage of food and medical care. The Canadian Embassy has already withdrawn most of its staff from the capital city. A day after Russia's election, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister condemned it as non-democratic and a blatant breach of international law. This after Russian President Vladimir Putin won a 5th term in office.
Дорогие друзья, я от души всех приветствую.
Putin celebrated his victory at a Moscow rally marking 10 years since Russia illegally annexed Crimea. Even his election opponents were on stage to congratulate him. Putin also spoke about the war on Ukraine, calling it more grave and tragic than Crimea's annexation. But he claimed his so-called special military operation is succeeding in its objectives. The election was tightly controlled by the Kremlin and widely believed to be rigged, with many of Putin's most vocal critics either exiled, imprisoned, or dead. Some European countries are trying to reduce their reliance on Russian fossil fuels. It's also part of a global effort to find cleaner energy in general. And there's plenty of hype surrounding hydrogen, which Canada is also banking on. Today, Ottawa signed a memorandum of understanding with Germany to export Canadian hydrogen overseas. Heidi Petracek looks at whether this fuel of the future will pay off.
In Hamburg, Germany, this metal recycling plant could one day be powered by Canadian hydrogen. A new bilateral agreement is building on Ottawa's plan to sell hydrogen from proposed production plants in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia to German customers.
To work together to fight climate change, but also to enhance energy security.
Hydrogen leaves behind only water when it burns. How clean it is depends on how it's produced. So-called green hydrogen is created using renewable resources like wind.
Taking a bunch of wind energy, using it to create hydrogen, and that could actually delay the province's transition off of coal.
Transporting hydrogen is also costly, emitting carbon, and requires ammonia, which is often used for plastics. For some, the price is too high.
So this is all really just about building out supply chains that aren't about dealing with the climate crisis.
But Ottawa insists cleaner energy is the plan, offering millions of dollars in export development loans and tax credits, and funding research to explore making hydrogen a fuel of the future. At this Dalhousie University lab, scientists are trying to determine the right mix of hydrogen and natural gas for highest efficiency and lowest emissions in common household appliances like hot water heaters and stoves.
The question is, are we going to be able to produce enough hydrogen at an economic level?
But I would say that where countries like Canada and Germany are starting are industrial processes that already use natural gas.
2 years ago, Canada's Auditor General found Natural Resources Canada based its hydrogen strategy on, quote, overly confident assumptions. That confidence now to be put to the test in the government's plan to see Canadian hydrogen head to Germany by 2026. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
There is growing concern about measles in Canada. Quebec has now confirmed 29 cases this year, and there's a new case in Toronto in an infant, bringing Canada's total number of cases this year to roughly 40. With many families traveling for March break, there is worry the highly contagious disease could spread quickly, especially in areas with low vaccine uptake. Heather Urex-West reports.
A Toronto infant is behind the country's latest case of imported measles. Officials say the baby had just returned home from a trip abroad. It's the city's second confirmed case this year. But across the country, experts are concerned with the number of cases Canada is seeing so far.
It's only March, but we're already seeing tallies that resemble what we've seen from the entire year before.
As one of the world's most transmissible diseases, under the right circumstances, a small number of cases can become several hundred very fast. The only thing stopping its spread is vaccine.
Canada has overall quite high vaccine coverage for MMR, around 90% for measles immunity. But there are schools and regions where coverage is a lot lower than that.
Using mathematical models, a team at Simon Fraser University looked at what would happen if those regions were exposed. The model suggests that within communities under 1,000 people, a measles outbreak could become out of control once vaccine coverage falls below 65%, with the potential of hundreds of cases when less than 55% are immunized. But within larger communities, above 8,000 people, even 70% vaccine coverage may not be enough to prevent an outbreak from spreading to hundreds of cases.
I think the more worrisome thing is what's happening globally. We know there's a large global resurgence of measles, and that means we're just at greater risk of importing cases into Canada.
Europe has seen exponential spread of measles in the last 2 years. There were 941 cases reported in 2022, 30,000 in 2023. 2024 could be even worse. But measles isn't the only vaccine-preventable illness making a return. Southern Alberta is experiencing an outbreak of pertussis, or whooping cough, because immunization rates there have fallen dangerously low. Health officials are hoping the spread of both diseases will serve as a warning. The time to get immunized is now. Heather Urex-West, Global News, Calgary.
MPs and Inuit leaders are seeking more than $131 million over 7 years to help eradicate tuberculosis in Inuit communities. Leaders are asking the Liberals to honor a promise they made in 2018 to eradicate TB in the North by 2030. The rate of this serious disease among Inuit people is nearly 700 times higher than among Canadian-born non-Indigenous residents. TB infects the lungs but is treatable and preventable. Donald Trump can't post bond while he appeals a fraud case. Coming up, what could happen if he misses next week's deadline? Plus, Sports Illustrated scores some good news. Despite long claiming to be a billionaire, former U.S. President Donald Trump is acknowledging serious financial trouble in the $454 million civil fraud case against him. In a new court filing, Trump's lawyers say he's been unable to raise the $500 million needed to post bond while he appeals the penalty. Our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Proskow joins us now. Jackson, what could this mean for Trump?
Hi, Neithu. The language in today's court filing is really quite stunning. Trump's lawyers are saying that he faces insurmountable difficulties in raising that $454 million bond for his New York fraud conviction. And this, of course, comes just weeks after he was forced to obtain a $91 million bond to cover that settlement with writer E. Jean Carroll. Through the court filing, we learned that Trump was rejected by nearly 30 potential sureties. Many of them were among the largest insurance companies in the world, but not a single one was prepared to underwrite a bond that size. And every single company rejected Trump's proposal to use his real estate as some form of collateral. Now, the judgment against Trump came in February after a New York judge ruled he committed fraud by falsely inflating the value of his assets. Trump has failed to win an extension to the 30-day deadline to meet his bond obligations, which he must do in order to file an appeal. The courts also rejected Trump's offer of a smaller $100 million bond payment. What does this mean in practical terms? Well, by next Monday, if Trump hasn't posted bond, his appeal is dead, and New York's Attorney General can start seizing his assets and properties.
Now that the judgment is final and there's no appellate bond that's been filed or cash deposited with the court, what Letitia James can do is attach and sell Trump's property. That's the most likely way she's going to enforce the judgment.
And Jackson, why would insurance companies be so wary of helping someone like Donald Trump?
You know, there's two things going on here. One is the amount of money he's asking for. It's about 4 times more than the maximum that most insurance companies would underwrite. But the bigger issue might be the liability that could come with backing a presidential candidate. Few companies want the risk of potentially having to enforce a bond against someone who could be the next president of the United States. Neithu?
All right, Jackson Proskow in Washington. Thanks, Jackson. The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in a crucial First Amendment case today. It is reviewing whether the Biden administration pressured social media platforms to censor posts promoting conservative viewpoints. The landmark case was filed by Republican lawmakers in Louisiana and Missouri. It alleges the Biden administration lobbied social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, now X, and others. The allegations are about unconstitutionally quashing or censoring inaccurate posts about the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines, and the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election results. The Supreme Court will determine whether the administration's communication with social media companies amounted to coercion. It will also examine what's being called jawboning, which is using a position of power to persuade or pressure companies to censor speech it didn't like. Sports Illustrated has averted demise after managing to find a new publisher. Digital media company Minute Media has signed a new deal with the publication's owner, Authentic Brands. They've agreed to operate the magazine for at least 10 years. There have been months of turmoil at Sports Illustrated. Most of its staff was laid off after its previous publisher failed to pay off its licensing fees. Mysterious mural ahead, the newest work from a world-famous British street artist. An Icelandic volcano is still spewing lava after erupting on Saturday, triggering a state of emergency and forcing residents and tourists to flee. It's the 4th time in 4 months the volcano has erupted on Iceland's southern peninsula. But authorities say the lava flows have decreased in intensity and the nearby town of Grindavik is safe for now. World-famous street artist Banksy has unveiled a new mural in London. In a social media post today, the artist confirmed the work as their own after it appeared overnight on a 4-story building. The mural features a person holding a pressure hose with green paint sprayed across the wall. When viewed from afar, the green paint mimics foliage of a barren tree in the park. Paying tribute. Next, Canadian politicians honor the legacy of Brian Mulroney. Final preparations are underway for Saturday's state funeral for former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. His family is now in Ottawa, where Mulroney will lie in state tomorrow and Wednesday morning. MPs are also back on Parliament Hill following a 2-week break. And today they paid tribute along with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Here's Mackenzie Gray.
It is not just his booming baritone that will forever echo in this chamber.
Cross-partisan political praise for one of Canada's most successful politicians.
He was motivated by service. And those things, those big things, have stood the test of history, 4 decades and counting.
Brian Mulroney, the boy from Baie-Comeau, remembered for his upbringing in the small Quebec town.
A modest Irish working-class upbringing taught him the value of work, family, neighborhood, loyalty, and merit.
Current Bloc MP Louis Plamondon, who was a member of Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative Caucus back in 1984, lauded the former PM for bringing in the GST and rallying other nations to end apartheid in South Africa, praise echoed by the NDP.
I would be remiss not to point out that Mr. Mulroney was a progressive conservative. He respected our democracy and the role of the media in a way that wasn't remarkable at the time, but is no doubt noteworthy today.
Mulroney was voted as the Greenest Prime Minister back in 2005, in part by the Green Party's Elizabeth May, who worked for him in the 80s, focusing on fixing the ozone layer and acid rain.
Brian Mulroney quite literally saved all life on Earth when Canada stood up and organized the Montreal Protocol and saved the ozone layer.
The speech is well received by the Mulroney family.
For us, sitting up in the gallery and hearing everybody speak so positively, probably not what he was used to, but he would have loved it, and we did as well.
Mulroney will now lie in state in Ottawa starting on Tuesday, before the state funeral for a Canadian political lion is held this Saturday in Montreal. Mackenzie Gray, Global News, Ottawa.
And Donna Friesen will host live coverage of Brian Mulroney's state funeral Saturday morning right here on Global. And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Your Canada is this Inukshuk at Upper Arrow Lake in Nakusp, British Columbia. Thanks so much for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.